Hey, welcome to Billy's Books. Today we're going to do Inside the Yellow Submarine by Dr. Hieronymus. Welcome to Billy's Books. We're going to do Inside the Yellow Submarine by Dr. Robert Hieronymus. This is a book about the making of the Yellow Submarine movie, which is an animated classic. And apparently it was a movie that broke a lot of rules and broke new ground, which is what the Beatles were all about. The Beatles were initially anxious or dismissive of an animated movie because they thought it was going to be like those cartoons, those Saturday morning cartoons, which they hated and actually had American voices. These guys, the Beatles, were so distancing that they were like, they would just offer the crappiest songs. So like if they did a song and they didn't like it very much, they're like, oh, we'll save that for the Yellow Submarine movie. That's how much the Beatles respected it, respected that movie while in the early production stages. They just threw away, garbage songs like "It's All Too Much," and they even wrote "It's Only a Northern Song" specifically about how it doesn't matter what they say or do. That's only Northern Song. You get the idea. Anyway, the throwaway tracks like "Hey Bulldog" and stuff like that, they considered a throwaway track. Hey Bulldog, but altogether now it's pretty throwaway, but likable because it's the Beatles. Anyway, the book is about the struggle, money versus art, in a nutshell. And there were high stakes. I'm going to read you a quote right off the bat from the introduction that sums up, I guess, how this book thinks of itself. The lesson that is epitomized by the struggle to birth Yellow Submarine is a lesson all humans need to observe. To do your best, one must combat against the status quo while knowing full well the odds are against you. It is this process of struggle that is important for our spiritual and material growth. It is the meaning of life. So, pretty serious stuff here. But what it comes down to is the same company that made those Saturday morning cartoons, TVC, television cartoons, a British company, took on the job of making the Yellow Submarine animated film, which is why the Beatles were skeptical, because they hated the cartoons. But they got George Dunning as the director, and he was like, we're going to make art. We're going to make real art. This is going to be a big deal. And, oh, by the way, you have $1 million to spend and has to be complete in a year. Well, that's kind of crazy because they didn't have a script, and Disney made full-length feature animation films in 2 or 3 years. So they bit off more than they could chew, and they didn't have enough time to chew it. And this becomes a artist versus producers collaborative struggle. The collaboration involved over 200 people eventually. The fact that it was finished is really kind of a bit of a miracle. I'm going to back up to talk about some specific things. The format of the book is lots of different commentary from the author, but then a bunch of there's a lot of it is, I would say more than half of it is just chunks of quotes from different people. Kind of like the anthology thing, where it's just like the one quote will be next to each other, and you'd see they often would contradict each other, which is all good fun. Paul claims to have written the song Yellow Submarine, which we all believed for the past 50 years, until they did the remake of Revolver, and before both Paul and probably John even forgot existed, was that very early John sketch going, in the town where I was born, no one cared, no one cared. That was completely forgotten, must have entered Paul's subconscious when he claimed he had an idea with Yellow Submarine and wrote the whole song. Anyway, that's all fun and games. So what they were doing while they were making the movie was, they hadn't the script yet, but they still animated scenes. They realized after a while, well, we have ideas, so we're just going to animate what we can, and then when the script is finalized, we'll stick them all together and make it work. Somehow it did. One of the reasons it's not just a stupid Saturday morning cartoon is they got this graphic mastermind, a Czech guy named Heinz Eidelman, who was very nice and didn't know it, had no experience in animation. He was just a graphic artist. He was spotted from an avant-garde German art magazine called Twen, um, and they all instantly liked what he was doing. He drew sketches of the four Beatles, and everyone was like, "Oh, those are great! Those are great!" Of course, each Beatle, when they saw the sketches, said, "That doesn't look like me," but liked all the other three. And so all four of them said that at one point or other, which I think is classic human nature. Heinz Eidelman was everybody worked hard, really, really hard, and they worked late nights, like 7 days a week or whatever. He was one of them, so much so that he would stay in all night. And one time, Heinz Eidelman got locked into the studio. He got locked in, and so he tried to. He escaped through the window and the back emergency stairs or whatever, and popped down to the street and went home. And the Bobbies thought he was a crook, and they chased him, which is very funny, in my opinion. You don't have to think that's funny too. If you don't, that's okay. The thing about Heinz, since he was a graphic designer instead of an animator, all of his ideas were really much more complex and difficult to animate. And all the animators were like, "Oh my goodness, that's really difficult." Like they would have buttons and all these frilly stuff. All these frilly stuff and extra buttons and details were hard to animate, especially when you turn. So, but they did it. And then there was, I guess the process was there were so many animators, because there was the art director, then there was the animators, then there were the people who did the tweens, which was and that was really like grunt work, doing the tweens, like, from frame 1 to 5, and then 5 to 10. Like the art guy the main animator would do 1 and 10, and then say fill in between those two. There'd be another guy that would do the 5, and then there'd be the real grunts would be 2, 3, and 4, and then 6, 7, and 8, and 9 would be all the grunts. You can see how, with however many frames per second, to make a feature-length film would take a long time, especially if you have no script. In fact, there were so many different scripts and so many different edits of the script that there was no final script until the movie came out. And the people who wrote the script didn't even know each other. So there was one guy who wrote it originally and had some of the ideas. And then later on, the writers who edited worked on that didn't know this guy, and they claimed that they came up with everything themselves. And everyone claims to have done more than they did. And since it was such chaos, it's really hard to keep track of it. There are some people who are really big names on the credits, and there are some people who aren't listed at all, and some would say that should be reversed for certain things. I get the feeling that everybody did a lot, but the thing is they didn't know what the other people were doing, therefore they discounted it. But then some writers, because this book was written in, when they re-released the Yellow Submarine movie in 1999, and the DVD and the new album and all that. This book is from around that era, so all these people reunited, those who lived, which is most of them. And they'd be like, "I never even heard of that guy," and that guy is like one of the really crucial people. They just never met them. The Beatles their voices were not used in the Yellow Submarine except for the live-action appearance at the end. So they had other guys, but this time they didn't have Americans. They had actual Liverpudlians, actors who were reading the lines and the script and everything like that. And they actually brought in somebody another writer just to make it more Liverpudlian. But then they had to have, even the Liverpudlian actors still had to talk very slowly in their accents so that the Americans audience could understand it, because obviously the American audience was crucial to making a feature-length film about the Beatles. And just basically anybody not from England, if you want to really go bit, you have to slow them down. And they did, and it worked. One of the rumors about the movie was that everyone must have been on drugs to make a psychedelic movie like that. And of course, the answer is you can't be on drugs and make a movie that demanding. You have to be on the whole time, because otherwise you'd never finish. And all the things. There was a cameraman once who did. People were talking about drugs and everything like that. Was a cameraman who did an all-nighter shooting tons of transparencies for the next day and, for a deadline. And when he was done, he got really drunk and fell asleep in the studio. And they came up the next morning, and they're like, "Oh my God, he got drunk!" And they were like, "Oh, here's all the work." So it's all about timing. Some of the writers claim that the trippy colors distract from the weak storyline. I think that's pretty true. Those grunts that I was telling about before, who did frames, 2 through 4 and all those, and frames 5 through 7 and 8 and 9 or whatever, they would, towards the end, they would just go to art colleges in London and just grab gloms of students and bring them and sit them down at desks and say, "We'll feed you, we'll pay you, just do these tweens quickly, please." And they did. Because everyone was working so hard and in such a collaborative environment, the whole movie was made within a year, and and in that time, a dozen babies were sired. So people were close. People were up close and personal. I mentioned the director George Dunning. He's the artist who he was the visionary that said, "We're not going to make a stupid cartoon. We're going to make art here." He was an eccentric. He was Canadian and very quiet. Some would call him sleepy. So one guy compared him to Droopy the dog or whatever. He was eccentric, but he had a vision, and he stood by it, and he fought against the money people and said, "No, we're going to make art. We're going to make art, not just crap." Okay, here's a big long paragraph. "In those days, you were given a rough storyboard and a script as an animator, and you did it all yourself. When they saw line tests, it was supposed to be right. Any corrections were frowned upon. It was pretty hard school to be brought up in. George Dunning kept coming in every morning. He'd look at the line test. He'd say, 'No, that's not quite what I mean. Can we try something else?' Then we'd spend most of the day and half the evening trying to fix it. Then he got this wonderful idea that, wouldn't it be great if we made the cat negative on one frame and positive on the next, so that when we run it, it flashes on and off. We did it, and it looked appalling. This went on for a week. Every morning he'd come in and say, 'No, that's not it.' I actually did a little bit of animation. I animated the cat quite realistically, and the agency saw that and said, 'Yeah, that's the sort of thing we want.'" Oh, by the way, he's talking about a gig in advertising before Yellow Submarine, so these guys have a history. George is quite annoyed about that because it was just a straightforward piece of animation. In fact, I said to my wife before I came in, "Don't be surprised if I come home tonight without a job," because I decided to confront him. When he said, "Well, I think we ought to do this," I said, "George, why don't we give them what they want?" He froze in one position for about a minute. He slowly stood up and walked out of the room and didn't say a word. He never had any more to do with that film. He just completely ignored them. We just finished them up, and it went into the agency, and they were happy. So yeah, once again, that is from previous advertising experience with George Dunning and this guy. So they're interesting people. There was friction between different people. Some people thought that one guy was good and the other was a jerk, and it goes both ways. Different writers would say, "Oh yes, I met the Beatles. John was really nice and the rest of them were arrogant." Somebody else would say, "Oh yes, I met Paul. He was a true gentleman, but John was really full of himself." Another would say, "Oh yeah, George is really cool, but everyone else was really rude to me." Everyone would say something different. And that would go with each other's writers too. So there was the Al Brodax was the producer, and he was the money guy that was trying to push everything through, and he was a pragmatist. And then there was the artist director, George Dunning, who was the soft-spoken weirdo. But most people claim that both of them were very nice to them. So it would only be if you sort of were upper level picking sides that you might not get treated nicely by either of them. Okay, here's something from the producer's perspective. "I wouldn't want to be a producer for any kind of money in the world." This is Jack Mendelson talking, one of the other guys. He's really talking about Al Brodax, the producer, who most people said was nice, but then somebody would say that he was actually full of it. So go either way. "It's a series of conning people into working for next to nothing, charming them, lying to them, and not being able to do it yourself, not having the talent, and having to find the talent, and then infuse them with the enthusiasm that you have, and let them sit up all night and do it. Some people are capable of doing all these things themselves. They don't need anyone else. They can write, direct, animate, compose music, like Charlie Chaplin. Producers know how to put it together, and they know how to get it out to other people. That's a gift. King Features was the movie studio, and then they hired TV Cartoons to do the actual animation. And then TV Cartoons hired all these people, right? So then at some point, the movie studio, King Features, was getting impatient, and they were like, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. And TV Cartoons was like, we're working on it, but you know, things don't move as fast as you want them to. And so there became a rumor that the movie studio was going to take over TVC. And that was all very messy. That ended up being basically the George Dunning versus Al Brodax, the producer. So here's an Al Brodax quote. Did the budget run out? He's answering that question. That's right. You know why? Because they were misspending the money. The first thing they did was they bought cars from themselves. Not Norman. He was just a lackey. But George Dunning and John Coates bought automobiles. That was the first purchase. Then I didn't know where the hell the money was going. I was there about 3/4 of the day, every day, because I had other things going. But the picture they would paint is, Brodax just handed over the rights and went away. And that's not true. I had my crew there. I imagine they didn't even mention Abe Goodman, but he was there every day. Now here's a quote from John Quotes, one of the guys that Al Brodax said bought an automobile immediately. The 2 vans were purchased out of TVC's budget and cost £350 each. They were commercial vehicles and were not taxable. These were the 2 vans that were used to transfer the cells to Dunning's basement. Now, they were also transferring the transparencies and all the art between the 2 different buildings they were using. But the fact that he mentions Dunning's basement is a whole other story. And that is that towards the end, when this threat of the takeover was going to happen, George Dunning, the director, who had never directed more than a 10-minute film before this, grabbed 2 reels of completed work and all the transparencies and artwork along with it, threw them in a van, took them out of the studio to his home, so that if there was a takeover, he'd have that leverage. That is clever, evil, and very unprofessional. Hey man, it was the 60s. In conclusion, this book is about art versus money. Art winning out in one of the few times when they had an artistic conviction and they stuck with it without the studio ruining it. Though they tried for a while. Anyway, so you could say it's art versus money, or it's the Beatles versus the Blue Meanies. You could say that was the subtext to that if you want. Or you could say it's the Cold War, or whatever, just love versus meanness. You can take it at every level. But the result of this very hectic, chaotic collaboration was a very cool, psychedelic, unique, groundbreaking animation feature film that is quite enjoyable and filled with groovy music. If you can't do, review.